Hey, you. Yeah. I have a secret. I don't really like jazz trombone. Okay, maybe that's not totally accurate, but outside of J.J. Johnson, Curtis Fuller, and a handful of modern trombonists, I've spent most of my transcription time listening to trumpet players, saxophone players, piano players. We all know that transcription is the most direct route to becoming better improvisers and better jazz musicians. And so I thought for this first lesson of the new year, we would dig into why we might want to transcribe our native instrument of trombone and why we might want to transcribe and look at some transcriptions of instruments other than trombone. Okay, let's start out with a few of the reasons why you might want to start with transcribing trombone players. The number one reason is that you need to develop your sound and the concept of your sound. If you never listen to other trombone players, you won't have in your ear what the kind of idiomatic sound of that instrument is. And even if you think, Sean, I want to develop my own sound, you want that to be informed by the tradition. What did J.J. Johnson sound like? What did Kid Ory sound like? What does Michael Dees sound like across the entire spectrum of the jazz trombone tradition? If we transcribe those recordings and really try to match their sounds, we can get that in our playing and then find our own way that has a solid foundation. Now, aside from learning what is idiomatic from a sound perspective, we also want to learn some of the idiomatic language of the trombone, the sort of things that lay well on the instrument. What sort of ideas really work on the instrument versus trying to force a saxophone idea to work on an instrument that is very non-saxophonistic. The final reason why we might want to stick with transcribing trombone players, especially in our early development, is that we want to be students of this instrument and learn what the greats played on this instrument. What did J.J. Johnson play? What did Bill Watrous play? What did Trummy Young play? These are all great players, and to really be students of the trombone, we need to know the different areas of that trombone tradition. Now, the flip side of that coin, why we might want to transcribe players that are not trombone players. These are the things that really drove me, especially in sort of the intermediate period of my development, once I had transcribed some JJ, once I had transcribed some Curtis Fuller, to start listening intently to other players and what they were doing. The biggest one for me is that these other players just connected more with the way I wanted to sound on the instrument. For better or for worse, a lot of the jazz trombone tradition just didn't really resonate with the way I wanted to sound, with what my voice sounded like. I was always much more interested in what trumpet players were playing, saxophone players were playing, especially trumpet players. They really have formed the backbone of my grasp of the jazz language. So sometimes you've got to go outside of that tradition of your own instrument in order to connect with where your voice lies. Secondly, for better or for worse, most of the important jazz albums recorded over the last 100 plus years have not been recorded by trombone players. That can be a harsh realization for some people to have to deal with. We really want to think, hey, I'm a trombone player, I can be a leader, I can be a frontline instrument. But the reality is that that's not what's reflected in the tradition of the music. Most of the great recordings have been made by saxophone players, trumpet players, piano players, these instruments as the lead instrument. And so we want to connect not only with our own instrument, but just those great recordings that all jazz musicians should be aware of. And this is certainly not a new concept or something that's unique to trombone. Most good instrumentalists transcribe musicians outside of their own instrument for a variety of reasons. Now for us as trombone, if we really want to bring the trombone as a foreground instrument, as a soloistic instrument, we've got to deal with some of that jazz tradition of the great recordings, whether they're on our instrument or not. Okay, cool. So there are some of the reasons I think we should and should not transcribe just on trombone. Let's actually look at some examples. We're going to check out 4 solos today. These represent solos that I transcribed maybe about 10 or 15 years ago now, when I was in that sort of end of the beginning part of my transcription into that intermediate period where I was looking for other voices. And I think these are great choices for all trombone players to look at when they're looking for material outside of the trombone. The first solo is Chet Baker on the tune Autumn Leaves off of his album She Was Too Good to Me. Now this is a classic Chet album and one that is commonly cited by most people as some of his really great playing. What you'll hear in here is really the hallmarks of his approach. Beautiful melodic playing, a real great sense of feel and swing. Now once we've gone through the transcription process, we could actually also see there's a few really nice 2-5-1 licks in this solo. This is a tune that's all driven by 2-5-1s, and there are a few places where he just plays things that are kind of classic vocabulary. So let's check this solo out. Now you might have noticed there was a couple measures in there where I moved it all up an octave respectively from where it was compared to where Chet played it. Clearly trumpet is just an octave up from us on trombone. However, you can get a little bit easier technical dexterity in some of the low registers. So like when he goes way down to a concert E. Yes, I could have played that in seventh, but instead I just moved the entire line up an octave because it fits better on the instrument. Now I mentioned he plays a few great 2-5-1s in here. That place where I moved it up an octave is a perfect example. That's just a classic line. You know, lots of chord tone, timing that really works. He just arpeggiates right up that 5 chord up to the flat 9, back down, resolves in a nice melodic way. Another one that I really enjoy comes in the 5th bar. Again, here, he's outlining the chords very, very clearly using arpeggios, but it's so melodic. It's very singable. It just sounds like a melody. It doesn't really sound like he's playing the changes in sort of a formulaic or lick-based way, but these are great things that you can move through all 12 keys. All right, solo number 2. This one comes from the great Kenny Dorham, one of the most underrated jazz trumpet players in the history of this music. He really had a harmonic language that was very unique and in many ways ahead of his time when he was really working sort of in the late 1940s, early 1950s, all the way through the rest of his career. So this song is Blue Spring, not to be confused with Blue Spring Shuffle, two different blueses. This is an F blues. I'm going to play the first 2 choruses of this, and the things you'll hear here are his really interesting approach to harmony. There's a few interesting little sidestepping 2-5-1s that he deals with. We'll talk about those after you hear it. So here is Kenny Dorham on Blue Spring. All right, so check out the line that is sort of in the 2-5-1 to 4. So in the 4th measure of the blues going to the 5th measure. Now normally that would be C minor 7, F7, B flat 7. Here he implies sort of an F sharp minor 7 to B7 type of sound. So he moves the entire thing a tritone. That's a pretty slick line. You know, you don't necessarily hear a lot of any instruments playing that, especially when this was recorded, let alone trombone players. So in order to get some of that language, especially if we want to go to the classic players, we might want to look elsewhere. And in this case, Kenny Dorham is a great place to go. So that was a few trumpet players. Let's talk about a tenor saxophone player. Tenor really translates well to the trombone, very similar range. Clearly they have a little bit more upper range before they go to the altissimo than we might have easily, especially for an intermediate level player. However, most of it is very transcribable, especially if you choose the solo carefully and just think about how much of the solo you deal with. So we're going to check out a Lester Young recording. This is Lester's Bebop Boogie. Now I cited this solo a handful of lessons ago when we were talking about improving our swing and our rhythmic feel. I think this is a great example of that. Lester is seriously swinging, and this entire solo just, I think, typifies his nice, easy, laid-back sort of swing. Another thing to consider here is if you want to sound like J.J. Johnson, you need to check out Lester Young, because Lester Young was hugely influential on J.J. Johnson. So if we want to think about where some of our great trombone idols got their stuff from, sometimes it wasn't from other trombone players. So here we go. Let's check out the solo. Now overall, it's all super, super swinging. He does do a few like false fingering things in there in the middle of the second chorus, which I tried to capture the best I could just by changing my articulation. But one thing you'll notice as well, if you go listen to the original, is that there's a lot of subtle articulation things that you need to check out. If we were to look at the turnaround of this blues, there are a few very small little scoops, a few things that he barely articulates. For example, in that D7 chord, he articulates the first two notes, but then just slides right through the next two notes. And all this type of stuff is what makes it swing. And so if you're listening to Lester Young and you're just worried about the notes, not worried about his sound, not worried about his feel, not worried about his articulation, that's not going to get you there. And so we need to try to incorporate that stuff, especially when it's coming from other instruments, because it may be more challenging to do on trombone than it is on tenor potentially. And so we want to really make sure we're matching that as accurate as we can. All right, now for our final solo of the day. This is Clifford Brown on the standard Joy Spring. This is a must-know solo for every instrumentalist trying to learn how to play jazz. The way that Clifford outlines the chord changes in this tune and the way he creates lines through what is not necessarily an incredibly challenging tune, but a tune that does move through quite a few key centers is just really beautiful. And he does it in such a seamless and melodic way that it's really something we should all aspire to in our playing. Now this one is a real challenge to execute on trombone cleanly, and you'll hear when I play it quite a bit slower than where Clifford does. He plays it 160, 170. I'm going to play it more about 120. And if I spend a little more time practicing it, I might be able to get it faster than that, but I doubt I'd be able to get it all the way to his tempo cleanly. Maybe a player who has a little bit better control over their multiple tonguing could. However, I don't really care about that. I'm worried about the language and the feel. And so I want to focus on singing this at full tempo. But then when I go to my horn, it's okay if I maybe slow it down a little bit. As long as I feel like I'm matching feel, I'm matching articulation, clearly I'm getting right notes, and all that information that's in there as far as just how does he navigate through the chords is still going to be there even at a slower tempo. So let's check out this solo on Joy Spring, Clifford Brown. I'm just going to play most of the first chorus. All right, cool. There was quite a bit of double time in there, and that's the biggest reason why I had to slow it down. If it didn't have that long section of double time, I could probably play most of it up to tempo relatively cleanly. Now, one thing you might have noticed in there is there's quite a bit of ornamentation. Check out the second 8 bars that is in G flat. Now, there's a couple ways you can slice dealing with that ornamentation as a trombone player. You could use some alternate positions sometimes. I'm just using my embouchure to do those turns and sort of faking it a little bit. This is a pretty common approach that a lot of trombone players will play. The biggest thing you want to focus on is not whether or not you play every ornamentation just like Clifford Brown did. You want to focus on the smoothness and the beauty of his lines and seeing if you can approximate, in some cases, those ornamentations. When we're in the middle register like this, it is very difficult to get some of those ornamentations happening in the same way that Clifford Brown did. This was the great thing about J.J. Johnson, is he took the language of bebop that Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker were playing and transferred it to the trombone in a way that really, really worked. When we're playing through Clifford Brown, we want to take that same approach, where sort of the gesture of the ornamentation is maybe a little more important than, hey, did I get every single note in there that Clifford played on this instrument? All right, there you go. 4 great solos to get started on transcribing instruments other than trombone. This is something that all great jazz musicians need to do, trombone or otherwise, is deal with a language outside of their own instrument. And we as trombone players need a practical way to get started on this. All right, I'll see y'all in the woodshed.